After some minor technical issues, I am here. Hi everyone. Wow, I wasn't expecting such a big crowd. There's some pretty cool artists on right now. I'm very honoured to have you here joining me for this talk on threesomes. In case you, my name's Leanne. I am a polyamory educator. I've been creating content about polyamory full-time for the past 3.5 years. I'm also training to become a sex therapist. And I've been non-monogamous for the past, I think, 8 years now. Which is why I believe I'm qualified to talk about this. I'm just going to do a bit of a demographics check just to get to know my audience a little bit, as there's a lot of you here. Please raise your hand if you identify as some flavor of non-monogamous, polyamorous, swinger, open, whatever. Okay, cool. Raise your hand if you identify as monogamous. Okay, and raise your hand if you're not sure or you're curious. Okay, there's a good proportion of you. Cool. Basically, this talk is going to be about threesomes. How to have a successful one, how kind of successful means, I'm going to be going through good or bad motivations to have a threesome, how to actually go about doing that, and things to look out for, basically. So whether you've had a threesome before or not. I hope that you learn something, and even if you actually have no plans on having a threesome at all, and you might just enjoy the fantasy and you're just here to just find out a bit more, I hope you take something from it as well, because I think that in general there's a lot to learn about sex, about relationships, about pleasure in the conversation about non-monogamy today. Actually, I'm just also going to check, raise your hand if you have had a threesome. Okay, cool. Congratulations. I think I'd start with why this talk as well. I've introduced myself, but I haven't, mentioned why I'm doing this in the first place. And it's because threesomes are one of the most common sexual fantasies, according to Dr. Justin Lehmiller, who conducted a study a couple years back. Over 90% of people have fantasized about a threesome. Which is a pretty high number. So a lot of people want to have one, but not a lot of people know how to go about it in a safe, respectful, consensual kind of way. And so this talk is meant to basically debunk some misconceptions and help you be a little bit more prepared going into it. So, where do we start? Let's start with kind of some misconceptions. So I think one myth that I definitely want to bust right out of the gate is that a lot of people seem to think that a threesome is kind of your gateway into non-monogamy, the easiest way to open up your relationship. And I can see why. You're doing this as a team, if you're opening up a monogamous relationship, you want to try something exciting together, maybe spice up your sex life, do something different. And it might feel having a companion, having a teammate, going into it, is going to be, a better time than if you were doing it separately. But what a lot of people don't consider is that having a threesome means watching your partner have sex with someone else. And potentially seeing them make noises and faces that you might have never seen before in your relationship. It might bring up a lot of challenging things if you see your partner engaging in a different dynamic than what you're used to, or having something different done to them that you haven't done before or maybe don't know how to do. So something to think about at the outset is, are you prepared for that? Right? Is it something that scares you? Is it something that turns you on? Is it something that you feel quite neutral about? Because there's lots of different ways to do non-monogamy, and threesomes are just one type, and a lot of people seem to think that if you're non-monogamous, then you have to have group sex. Not the case. Lots of people date separately and have multiple separate relationships, and obviously those people know about each other, but they don't necessarily want to be in a bedroom all at the same time. So lots of different ways to do non-monogamy. If you want to open up your relationship, you don't necessarily have to have a threesome. You could do it a lot of different ways, but threesomes are what we're going to be focusing on today. Another misconception is that a threesome will save your relationship. Some chuckles in the audience. So yeah, I think this is perpetuated a little bit by the media. There's like a lot of TV shows where couple has super dead sex life, couple invites a third into the bedroom, usually a hot bisexual woman. They have a nice time and then suddenly they're fucking like rabbits every day. That sometimes happens, not all the time though. Like threesomes can certainly be a really great way to broaden your horizons, to explore your sexuality, to try some new things, explore some dynamics you might not have otherwise. But if you have existing issues in your relationship, like whether it's because you don't know how to communicate or you don't know how to advocate for yourself, set boundaries, etc., a threesome isn't going to fix that. Likely going to make it worse, actually. So something else to keep in mind is, if there is a mess going on in your relationship, don't bring more people into that mess. It's kind of like, don't have a baby if you think it's going to save your marriage. Don't bring in a third person. Like bringing in other people into an existing mess is never a good idea. So yeah, like a threesome may introduce some opportunity sexually, and it can be like an exciting, novel time, but it is not a cure-all for a relationship. Similarly, a threesome will not necessarily end your relationship. There is a misconception that people open up their relationship as a last resort, if as a way to find a safe exit out of the relationship while keeping your existing partner as a safety net. And while I don't deny that there are definitely some people who do that, generally speaking, that's not something that tends to work out in the long term. So either way, don't bring other people into a mess that maybe could be solved by the two of you just kind of communicating. And by the way, just for this talk, I will be focusing a fair bit on couples opening up from a monogamous relationship, as that is probably the most common way that people kind of go about having a threesome. But that's also not necessarily the case. Three friends could come together. A lot of the threesome configurations that I've been a part of is if I had two friends with benefits or something, they tend to get along, and then we all got together. You don't have to be in a relationship. Another misconception is that everyone needs to interact with each other. How's it now? Do I just shout then?
Yeah, try it myself right now.
Okay, I'm going to do my best to shout. Okay. Sorry about tech issues, guys. Can the people in the back hear me? Okay. We'll see how my voice fares for the remainder of this hour. But yeah, just wave your hand if you can't hear me at any point, and I'll try and shout. Okay. So, where was I? Yeah, so I was talking about another misconception being that everyone needs to interact with each other sexually. And while it is certainly fun if you do that, there's lots of different configurations of threesomes. There could be threesomes where three of you all messing around with each other, or two people are focusing on one person, or two people are interacting and one person's watching or maybe directing. There's lots of different ways that you can do this. So really big thing to think about at the outset is, what do you want out of it? Because three of you can be together being I want a threesome, but you might not want the same thing out of a threesome. And I've definitely run into this, personally a bunch of times, where people are not on the same page, and then they go into it, feelings are hurt, people get upset, and it's not a good time. So definitely, just like with one-on-one sex, communicate beforehand about what your fantasies, what your desires, what your needs and boundaries and all that kind of stuff are, so that you're on the same page and you can make sure whether you actually want the same thing.
Because if one person is like, I want all the attention to be focused on me, and the other person is like, well, you know, I'm thinking that, like, you know, yeah, like I would be the kind of center of attention, then, you know, someone's going to get upset, right? Another misconception is that only men want a threesome. And I think this is kind of, you know, kind of societal, patriarchal, where men are typically stereotyped to be the more like sexually aggressive types, and the ones who are more like into that kind of stuff, and that's not the case. You know, as a woman, has had a lot of threesomes. I can definitely debunk that, and also, yeah, like women may have had their sexuality kind of controlled or erased or just, you know, discouraged historically, but that doesn't mean that their sexual desires aren't there. So, you know, I'm sure there's a number of you in the room, like, of different genders who are like thinking about having a threesome. And similarly, along the lines of like only men want a threesome, there's also a misconception that like the women involved are forced into it or being coerced into it somehow, or that they're like the victims of the situation. Like, as someone who exists online, like I make a lot of content online about my life and my relationships and that kind of stuff, and like even though I've been doing this full time for like 3.5 years, and this is my job. A lot of people are constantly commenting, being like, "Oh, like, so you're the one who cries yourself to sleep, like, while your boyfriend fucks other people." And I'm like, I don't know. I've been doing this for like 7 years longer. Like, I don't know what you're on about. So those are kind of some misconceptions like at the outset, and potential kind of conversation topics to think about if you are considering this. So, potential motivations for having a threesome. Let's get into that. There are some good motivations to them, and there are some bad motivations. So, you know, like I said earlier, threesomes can be a great opportunity for self-discovery. Whether it's about like sexuality, or kink, or just, you know, being able to do things in a group of three that you wouldn't be able to do as a pair. There's also like a huge advantage of like exploring bisexuality. I personally, when I first came out as bisexual, was very nervous to explore with women alone. But I found it a lot easier to explore through group sex first before I got a little more confident once I knew what I was doing. And this is a story that is shared by some other bisexuals I know. Sometimes it can be more comforting to explore queerness amidst familiarity. Equally, some other people might just kind of want to do it entirely separately, and that's fair enough as well. But that's kind of one potential motivation for having a threesome. Another one is just, like learning different ways to experience pleasure, being able to witness other people experiencing pleasure in different ways, enjoying their bodies in different ways. If you are, for example, like a single person joining like an established couple for a threesome, it can be very fascinating to watch like their existing dynamic. You know, like what does it look like watching two people who know each other's bodies very well? What could you potentially learn from that? There's a lot to discover there, and it's also probably hot to watch rather than two people, you know, kind of fumbling if they don't know each other that well. Another motivation would just be like, fuck it, you know, like if you want to have fun, you want to have a new experience. It doesn't have to be some super philosophical reasoning for doing it. You could just want it because sex is fun and pleasure is good, and all of that could have been encouraging that. Okay, thank you. So like when I was like mentioning to some people at this festival like that I was going to be doing this talk, some people were asking like, well, like I want one, but like how do you talk to your partner about it? And I don't know if it's here, but like someone told me like, oh, like like that sounds like an interesting talk. I'm going to bring my wife, and I was like, I hope she knows that. You were thinking of this, like if you're in the audience, like I hope you've talked about this before, and this talk is not like the first time you're bringing this up. I would not recommend that unless there's super chat. But like, in terms of like how to bring it up, be tactful. Okay. So in terms of how to approach your partner, if you're in a monogamous relationship and you're thinking about opening up, you wanna test the waters. You're not sure. Firstly, I think be prepared for any kind of response, right? Like they might be like, wow, yeah, like I've been thinking about that for a while. In which case some people might be like, oh shit. Or they might be like, like, I don't know, I might have to like think about it and see. Or they might be like, absolutely not. In some scenarios, even bringing up the conversation could be grounds to end the relationship. Unfortunately, we live in a mononormative world where, yeah, if it's admitted in your relationship that like you've been thinking about other people or you're attracted to other people, like for some people, that's unacceptable. And you know, I personally think that like having attraction is a different thing from actually acting on it. But you know, other people have different boundaries. So I think like if you're going to be bringing this up to your partner, this is something that you're seriously thinking about, you have to potentially be prepared for a negative reaction. And so in line with that, you know, depending on like what your partner's like, you know the best, what potential concerns might they have? Like things that can come up when someone brings up like doing something like this is like, oh no, like does this mean that you want to leave me? Does this mean that I'm not enough? Does this mean that you're trying to find someone to replace me? Like what if I feel left out? There's a lot of different kind of fears and concerns that can come up. And you know, I think it's important to address these at the outset. If you want to reassure your partner that yeah, like you're doing this as a team, you want to explore this together, this isn't like a soft exit from the relationship. And you know, try and address these concerns head on so that you can both be prepared. And if they say no, respect the no. You know, and sometimes like this is like where some people come into crossroads where like one person really wants to open up and the other person's more reluctant or straight up doesn't want to. And yeah, like in those scenarios you might need to have to make a very difficult decision. And that decision is entirely down to you. Like, you know, what's more important to you. But that might be outside the scope of this one. But that's just like, you know, brief overview of like approaching a partner and things to think about. Something that I've seen is helpful, now that there's a lot more media about non-monogamy and polyamory, it might be useful to say like, oh, I read this article in the news, or like, oh, I saw these characters on this TV show. What do you think about that? Rather than going like, hey, like, I might actually want to do this. To test the waters, kind of gauge their response before you actually express like your own personal desires for it. So yeah, what do you think about it? Okay. So, in terms of logistics, in terms of like, okay, hypothetically, you know, you found the people you want to do this with. Like, how are you going to approach this? I think the first thing is, like I said earlier, have a conversation, discuss, and don't assume, because not everyone wants the same thing out of a threesome. So, like, what kind of dynamics do you want? What fantasies do you have? What are your desires? Like, what are the things that you don't want to do? Like, what are your personal boundaries? What do you be uncomfortable with? And all of these are personal to the individual. But I would also say, like, you know, while it's good to have this communication at the outset, don't overly restrict yourself such that, like, when you're in it, you're constantly thinking about all the rules and regulations that you need to follow, and then you just don't have them. So a little bit of flexibility is required, and a little bit of, you know, open-mindedness. So set realistic expectations. Like, don't, you know, set rules that like set yourself up for failure, but also don't make it too restrictive. And however that looks, you know, like might depend on the individual. An important note on safety. A misconception I forgot to mention earlier is that like a lot of people assume that like kind of different forms of non-monogamy inherently involve like higher risk of catching STI. And I want to address that because contrary to popular opinion, like non-monogamous relationships are actually statistically no more or less likely, non-monogamous people rather, are no more or less likely to catch an STI than monogamous people. This might be surprising to you because like non-monogamous people statistically probably have sex with people and so therefore follow this higher risk. But there's two reasons why there's no difference. Firstly, non-monogamous people are open about the fact that they're non-monogamous. partners they have, about the sex that they're having, about when they last got tested, about when they last used protection. They tend to be a more sexually responsible group. And so, you're much more likely to talk about this stuff beforehand. And even in a scenario where someone does catch an STI, they're likely to, inform their partners so that they do whatever they need to do so that it doesn't pass on. The second reason is that monogamous people cheat a lot. In the study that was conducted in 2015, that proved this, the monogamous people who were studied in the group, 25% of them cheated in the relationship. And when they cheated, they were less likely to use protection, which is why? And secondly, because they were cheating, they wouldn't inform their partner. And so if they caught something, their partner would get it, and you can imagine yourself. So, living a life of non-monogamy doesn't necessarily mean that you're more at risk of catching STI. You're actually probably more likely to have those conversations about it. So, there's kind of sexual safety to be aware of. Generally, it's recommended you get tested every 6 months, regardless of whether you're not in a monogamous relationship. Every 3 months, if you are having sex with new partners frequently. There's lots of different types of protection. I'm sure most of you probably learned this in school. So I'm not going to go through that. But apart from sexual safety, there's also emotional safety. How are you going to make sure that you feel safe in this environment? It's not just about the people that you're choosing to be with, but also how are you going to voice your concerns in the moment? Do a self-assessment. Are you the type of person who's able to advocate for yourself in the moment? Or are you someone who's a bit susceptible to peer pressure? Because if you're in an environment where you're not just having sex with one person, but two people, and they want something and you don't, how good at expressing that are you? Are you going to be concerned about ruining an environment and want to go along with things? In which case, how do you mitigate that? And if there are big feelings that come up during, how are you going to voice it? Perhaps it might be helpful to discuss beforehand, a code word or something like that, like a safe word, so that everyone understands that when that safe word is said, that means there's kind of someone's feeling uncomfortable. Maybe things need to slow down. Maybe things need to stop. And you might kind of talk to each other about your tendencies, if you kind of freeze up, for instance, if you don't know what to do, then that's kind of something for your partners to be aware of. And don't be afraid to be vulnerable with each other, because this is a vulnerable experience. Sex is an intimate experience. And if you want to have a good time, you want to be...
Okay. How was that? Thank you so much. What was I? I was talking about kind of safety and expressing kind of concerns and fears, if big feelings come up. And I'm going to, talk a little more about jealousy in a little bit, as that's probably one of the most common questions that I get. But before I do that, in this section on logistics, I wanted to also talk about something called couple privilege. Raise your hand if you know what couple privilege means. Okay, a few of you. Okay. So, for those of you who don't know, couple privilege is a term used in the non-monogamous community for the privileges and benefits that people who are in a couple, or present themselves as a couple or perceived as a couple, get in a society that prioritizes monogamous relationships and marriage. Couple privilege comes up. Marriage, I think, is probably the biggest example of that. You can only marry one person at a time. Polygamy is currently illegal in most parts of the world. And as such, people who are married have, benefits, and, whether it's tax benefits or social privilege, they're typically seen as more responsible and mature, even if that isn't necessarily the case, than people who are single. Or even if they're in a non-monogamous dynamic, if they have other partners who they're not married to. So this has, lots of consequences financially, legally, but also socially. And this, of course, impacts the other people involved in a non-monogamous dynamic. And of course, there's also just, if two people have a long existing history together, they might make assumptions kind of going into a threesome situation that may not benefit the third person who's there. So if you are a couple who's, looking for a third, as they say, then you might want to think about, like, not just prioritizing your own desires, but also the desires of this new person who's coming into the dynamic. A very big mistake that I see couples make is being like, oh, it's such an honor to have you join us. Here is a laundry list of requirements, which are highly unrealistic and very restrictive and typically put a lot of the burden of risk on the third person. And what's worse is if something goes wrong, they typically blame the third person and cast them out. Not a fun experience on the other end. So, couple privilege, like white privilege, male privilege, is something that you can't just get rid of overnight. It's something that exists, and it's something that you have to consider and mitigate when you're interacting with other people. So yeah, basically, just be considerate. It's not all about you having this new experience with your partner. There is a whole other person that you're dealing with who has their own needs and desires and fantasies, and you want to be trying to incorporate them. Like, it's a team effort, not just like two-person dictating what's happening and the third person kind of going along with it. So yeah, that's a really big mistake that I see people make, and we have a term for this in the non-monogamous community. It's called unicorn hunting. Like unicorn, because like allegedly, like a person who is down to join a couple for a threesome, usually bisexual, usually a woman, usually cis, not necessarily, but typically. Allegedly, they're quite rare. In my opinion, I don't think unicorns are that rare. I think that the couples who know how to treat unicorns well are the rare ones. So yeah, don't be that couple. Like, if you're going to be going about that. So yeah, like, it's just kind of, thinking about power dynamics, like, not just like within like this context, but also in life generally, because the past one's political. So another concern that comes up in like a threesome scenario is performance anxiety. One-on-one sex can be stressful enough, but like, peer pressure, etc., like, means that some people might be like, oh, like, what if I'm not hard enough? Like, what if I'm not wet enough? Like, what if I can't do this thing? And here is where I really encourage you, like, not just for like a threesome, but also just for your sex life generally, to think about what pleasure looks like when the focus is not on your genitals or even on orgasm. So what are ways that you can experience pleasure just in the moment without like having to reach a particular goal? What does it look like, without penetrative sex? There's a lot of potential for like exploration there that you'd be, very surprised to discover, like, even with like kink dynamics or just like different ways to touch. So, like if in the moment like things aren't working as they should, that's fine. You have hands, you have a mouth, you can use them. And there's like a lot of pleasure to be found there as well. And it's not like lesser sex if you can't do kind of penetrative sex like you would in a one-on-one context. And even in a one-on-one context, that's also not a big deal. There's lots of different ways to give and receive pleasure without that as well. So yeah, like, in terms of things to do as well, because people always like, okay, so like we're in the moment, like what, how does it actually kind of logistically work in that context? Because there's 3 people, there's a lot of multitasking involved. So yeah, a couple of different dynamics is, yeah, like, you could take turns spoiling each other. One person gets all the focus and then you switch. Or you could have 2 people interacting with each other and one person watching, maybe touching themselves, maybe directing what's going on, like it's your own kind of personal porn situation. They could be assisting, so like, for example, if it's a kind of more kinky scenario, if one person wants to be held down, like by one person, while like having sex with the other person, that could potentially be fun. So like, these are things that you could potentially like think about when you are like fantasizing about your desires and wanting to bring these to the people that you might potentially want to have a threesome with. Okay, now I'm going to address jealousy. So yeah, like, I think a lot of people like the idea of a threesome in theory, but then in practice they're like, what if I feel like anxious or possessive or upset or lonely or whatever, like in that context. And generally speaking, like I like to break a jealousy down into like 3 big emotions. So jealousy could be caused by fear. A lot of the time, actually, I would say like over 60% of the time, like when I speak to clients, like the jealousy is caused by fear. It might be fear of abandonment, fear of like not being enough, like fear of being replaced, fear of loneliness, and yeah, like that creates a lot of anxiety. The moment that it might make you freeze up. Another emotion might be sadness. It might be grief for like what your relationship used to be and how it is now. It might be grief over like feeling left out in the moment. It could be just the feeling of loneliness and the sadness that comes from that. Another big emotion could be anger. So anger in terms of like feeling betrayed by the situation. If you have kind of some belief that your partner having sex with someone else is a betrayal, this can be particularly common for people who have trauma from cheating. Anger could also be coming from some possessiveness over your partner. And typically, if you're experiencing anger, there is usually a wrong that you feel needs to be redressed. And so in that situation, like what would be the wrong that you want redressed? Like, is it possible to redress that wrong? Is it reasonable to expect the people around you to redress that wrong? And yeah, so breaking it down into these 3 emotions, you can better assess where your jealousy is coming from. Perhaps it might be a combination of the above. And then with those, you can be like, okay, I'm feeling this emotion and I'm feeling it because of this. It might be like internal factors or external factors. So internal factors would be your personal kind of insecurities or traumas from what's happened in the past. Like maybe you like were bullied and felt very left out at school, and kind of seeing 2 people have fun in front of you while you feel left out is triggering. Could be that you were cheated on in the past and kind of that trauma is coming up again. And it could be just kind of personal insecurities around kind of self-esteem. External factors would be things going on outside of you in your relationship. Like if your partner is, if you perceive that kind of some incompatibility with your partner, and that's kind of becoming obvious in the scenario, or your partner isn't meeting your needs, or you're actually feeling kind of neglected and ignored in the scenario, and you want to, communicate about that. So broadly, kind of thinking about the big 3 emotions, assessing whether it's like internal or external, that might help you kind of assess the situation for yourself. And then figure out what to do next, whether it's, doing some personal work, having, a little bit of journaling, thinking about that, or in the moment talking to the people involved, like, or maybe afterwards, like if you're talking about like what went well and what didn't. So yeah, and also like these tips on jealousy are also kind of broadly applicable, like even if you're not in an open relationship. So, yeah, so you've had all these conversations, you feel ready, you've done some research, you're gonna go into it, but also, you can't be absolutely prepared for every single scenario. So a good amount of, sustainable, successful non-monogamy is learning to expect the unexpected. I think a good amount of flexibility and resilience is required to make things work. Because something might happen, or a boundary of yours might be crossed that you didn't know was a boundary, or that you didn't expect to happen. And sometimes it's not because of anyone particular being malicious or doing something wrong. Sometimes it just might be the situation that kind of sucks. And so it's important to recognize that. It's important not to kind of point the finger, even if it feels very easy to do that, or very tempting to do that, rather. And to, like kind of ground yourself in the moment and actually kind of see like what's really going on, which, I know is easier said than done, but it does take practice. So, like all of this is like why I'm like, it's not like entry level stuff. Let's see, have I left out anything? I also wanted to kind of note on gender for a second. Like, as I said earlier, like a very common configuration, like when couples are kind of looking to have a threesome with a third person, is they're typically looking for a woman, typically a bisexual woman. And I gotta ask, why is that? The answer is pretty obvious: patriarchy. The kind of assumption that men are allowed to have multiple female partners, but if a woman has multiple male partners, she's a slut, or whatever kind of bad words. And historically, like, women were punished much more heavily for having multiple partners than men. And so there's a lot of kind of societal norms and beliefs that mean that a configuration where there's two women and one man is much more socially acceptable than two men and one woman. There's a reason why the threesome between two men and one woman is called like the devil's triangle, the devil's tango, or whatever it is. I've heard different versions of that. If you are someone, if you are a couple and say, like, hypothetically, like, both of you are bisexual, or like, maybe you're both straight, but you're kind of both open to like some or whatever gender kind of being involved. Like, think about, if you're more open to one than the other, think about why. There might not necessarily be anything behind it. It might just be like, oh, like, one of you straight, one of you's bisexual, you want to be with someone who, both of you can be involved with. Fair enough. But if you're like very, very deeply opposed to like one more than the other, there might be some bigger reasons and kind of personal biases behind that. And so yeah, just something to consider, because there's a lot of societal norms and institutions and whatever that influence us to think certain ways about like gender and sexuality. And it's important to consider that, because a lot of the time, unfortunately, queer women are seen as objects, are seen as, I guess, like, devices for male pleasure. And I've met way too many men, unfortunately, who have, I guess, like if they have like a female partner who is bisexual, for instance, like they don't really see her sexuality as like existing like outside of like for his pleasure. And I kind of wanted to make a note of that, because don't fetishize your partner's sexuality. Like, their sexuality, exists beyond you and isn't defined by you, and they might do things that you don't necessarily find a turn on, but that is still very much part of their sexuality. So yeah, that's kind of just my little soapbox on bisexuality specifically. Okay, where are we doing on time? Okay, we're good. So yeah, like, I've gone through potential motivations, good and bad, to have a threesome. I've gone through like different kind of logistics and like things to consider and things to talk about. But I also kind of just want to wrap it up by saying that sex is supposed to be fun at the end of the day. So if a threesome doesn't sound appealing to you, if your partner is trying to coerce you into one and you're not sure, you don't have to do it. And if you're in a non-monogamous scenario and someone is like, well, like, I have another partner, like, maybe we should have a threesome, and you're not attracted to them, you are also allowed to say no. So, don't be having any sex that you don't want to have. I feel like that should be obvious, but like, there we go. So yeah, like, only do it if you feel empowered, or at the very least if you are curious and you want to. Like, not just because your partner's trying to pressure you, or they're trying to manipulate you, or they're saying that they're gonna end things with you if you don't. Like, don't listen to any of that bullshit. So yeah, don't try and do it to be the cool girl either. Like, I see this a lot, like, where people are like, yeah, like, I want to be chill, like, I want to be easygoing, and they people please in a scenario where they should be saying no. Another thing is, just in general, like, having these conversations about opening up your relationship, or just having conversation about like the different desires you have outside your relationship and the different relationship styles you could have, is beneficial, because like, non-monogamy existing doesn't need to be a threat. I've met a lot of people who have ended their friendships with me or stopped talking to me because they feel that I'm a threat to their relationship just by like existing around them, and they fear that I'm going to be influencing their partner to want the same thing. And I'm just like, if you've had that conversation and you're confident that your partner wants monogamy, then you have nothing to worry about. Whereas if you do have that conversation and you find out that you have different desires, then at least you have more information to go forward about whether you're compatible or not. So, like, regardless of whether you actually want to open your relationship or not, I think it's really important to have a conversation at the outset about, like, different relationship styles, what you're open to, what your boundaries are, how are you going to define cheating in a relationship, because, like, even in a monogamous relationship, that, you know, like, it isn't necessarily universal. I think a lot of people agree that in a monogamous relationship, you shouldn't have sex outside the relationship. But what about flirting? What about watching porn? What about liking someone's pictures on Instagram? Like, there's so many different boundaries that people just don't discuss in a monogamous relationship because it's just kind of assumed that everyone's on the same page, and most likely you're not. So, but if you do choose to open up your relationship, whether for a threesome or something else, it's a really good opportunity to challenge your relationship in a good way. You know, like you might go through some growing pains. There might be some conflicts, but a relationship is not about preventing conflicts from happening. I mean, well, a good amount of it is. You don't want to upset your partner just deliberately. But it's also about navigating through conflicts together. It's also about getting good at, you know, bouncing back when things go wrong. Because there's always going to be ups and downs in any relationship. And you don't want to, you know, have it be that it falls apart the moment, like, something bad happens. So, yeah, like, having these honest conversations, like, being confident in the relationship style that you want to practice, you know, thoroughly kind of exploring and questioning these things is good for everyone. You know, even at the end of it, if you're like, yeah, like, actually I'm comfortable with monogamy, at least you've done that thinking and you're not just going along with it because that's what everyone else is doing. And this applies not just for your relationship style, also applies for, like, whether you want kids, whether you want to get married, like, you know, like, all of these things, like, need to be, like, considered, you know, individually. So I think as well, you know, I've given you a lot of, like, tips and things to think about, but when or if you actually go about putting this to practice, you are allowed to make mistakes. No one's perfect. Well, very few people are perfect. Kind of the first time they try this kind of thing out. And the most important thing that is that you learn from your mistakes and try again. So even if you have a threesome and it goes completely catastrophically, doesn't necessarily mean that you're not cut out for this. Doesn't necessarily mean that you're, like, not non-monogamous, or, like, that you know, these things should be better kept to fantasy. You know, it might just be the wrong person or the wrong time or the wrong emotional state. Like, don't be afraid to try again, and don't be afraid to, like, think about yeah, like, just what your goals are long term. So yeah, like, what I said earlier about just approaching these situations with curiosity, not just, like, for other people and, like, what their desires are, but also in yourself. Like, if feelings come up, like, rather than being like, oh no, I don't want to be feeling this, I'm not going to think about it right now. Be curious about what's happening. Be curious and try to interrogate your emotions. Like I said earlier, flexibility and resilience, like, being able to bounce back, being able to kind of be open to, like, different points of view or different desires, different dynamics, and also vulnerability, because you're having some intimate conversations, you're doing some intimate stuff, and you have to approach these things with honesty if you want to have a good time. So yeah, like, before we go to the Q&A, I'm also just gonna recommend some resources in general. There is a TV show that I highly recommend on Channel 4. It's called Open House. Has anyone seen it? Yeah, some people seen it. And basically, it's a reality show where couples go on the show with the intent to open up their relationship. And there's actually a therapist on site to help them talk through it, and the show is invested actively in helping these people open up their relationship, whether it's because they want polyamory or they want a threesome or someone wants to get cut or, like, whatever. Yeah, I highly recommend that show if you're, like, thinking about it and seeing, like, what it looks like in real time. It's also pretty sexy, so, like, it's a pretty fun show to watch. So there's also lots of, like, book recommendations that you can find on my social media. So you can find me on social media at Polyphilia blog. So that's, well, you don't have internet right now, but POLYPHILIA blog, Polyphilia blog. I'm pretty much on all social channels, but I'm, like, most commonly found on Instagram. Yeah, how much time do we have? Okay, we got time for questions. But yeah, that's it for my talk. And I hope you enjoy it.
We'll come to you next, all right? Hey, I really enjoyed your talk. That was really good. Very
Thank you.
informative. Thank you. How do you find somebody when you and your partner are attracted to different people?
How do you find somebody when you and your partner are attracted to different people? That's interesting. I mean, it depends on like whether you're looking for a threesome where like, you know, the three of you want to interact. Like if there really genuinely is no overlap at all, then I would suggest like taking turns, like, you know, having a threesome with someone who might be one of you guys' types, and like having it be like focused on one person and then swapping it the other way around. But yeah, like that sometimes happens. You know, like sometimes two people in a relationship like aren't attracted to the same people. Whether it's like, yeah, like different genders or like just, you know, different types of people, like personality wise or whatever. So yeah, like if there's no overlap on that yeah, like I can imagine how finding someone could be an issue. But yeah, like you can take turns. It could, you know, it could be, you might want to explore like different configurations of threesome, you know, maybe like even have like one person watch and that kind of stuff. Like there's a lot that you can still do. But yeah, good luck with it. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, just to quickly address the people that might want to join two people in an established dynamic.
Yes.
What are some red flags or some green flags to look out for in those two people?
Great question. So if you are like the single person joining a couple, like what are some red and green flags to look out for? So I think like at the outset, like a couple that seem to be very focused on what they want. So they're like, yeah, like we're looking for someone who looks like this and who dresses like this and who likes these things. And, you know, it's very much like our relationship is the priority and you should be grateful to be here kind of vibe. Yeah, like avoid that. So I think that's the kind of most obvious one. But also like, I think, the people who like, I guess like, yeah, like make assumptions as well, like about you and what you want. I had a threesome one time with a couple where like in the middle of it, like the guy tried to like stick a finger up my ass and I was like, we didn't talk about this. I didn't, yeah, like I don't really want to do this right now. And he was like, oh, like sorry, like my girlfriend likes it when I do that, so I thought you would. Couple privilege. So, you know, like making assumptions that like, oh, just because you, like, you know, your partner enjoys this kind of sex, that other people is also going to enjoy it the same way. Not the case, you know? Like, you might, like, rub someone's clit clockwise, someone else might want it anti-clockwise. Like, could be as simple as that. But yeah, I think, like, green flags to look out for would be, like, well, yeah, you know, asking you about your desires and kind of what you want, and you know, it being like a team effort between you and trying to like incorporate your desires into that. I think as well, like, you know, generally speaking, like I look at. Well, this might be my personal bias, but because of just the frequency of men pressuring their female partners into these kinds of things, I always make sure that the woman is equally enjoying it. And I think this applies in general. Make sure both of them seem into it. Like, you know, if one person is like very enthusiastic, doing all of the talking, all the initiating, and the other person is just kind of like, you know, quietly going along with it, that's probably not a good sign. And so, you know, even kind of checking in the moment and being like, hey, like, are you still having a good time? Like, you know, could be, yeah, like you could be preventing an assault, like just by asking something like that. And what else? Yeah, like, and I think like just, in the moment as well, like, so, like a couple who are less focused on getting to kind of like the penetration and like more focused on just like, you know, kind of touching each other, experiencing different types of pleasure, like taking their time. And because yeah, like I think in porn it's like there's this misconception that like threesomes, like there's like sucking and fucking going on for fucking hours, and in reality it's like, I mean, my first threesome, in the middle of it I was with my boyfriend and like someone else that he was sleeping with, and me and her were having a good time, and at some point he was just like, would you guys like some green tea? We were like, yeah, we'll have some green tea, and he went and made us some tea, and he brought it back. We had a little break and then we continued. So yeah, like you're allowed to take breaks, you're allowed allowed to like, you know, pause in a moment and be like, wow, like I'm overheating, you know, like can we like do something else, or like, you know, yeah, you're allowed to do like what feels good to you in the moment. It's not you're like if you're with the right people, it won't feel like you're ruining the vibe. So yeah, I hope that helps. Anyone else?
Time for one last question.
Time for one. Yeah.
Seth?
Haven't really formulated this in my head properly yet. But you mentioned at the beginning, for bisexual women, it's often the case that like sameness can be a kind of gateway into exploring their sexuality. But then, doesn't that leave lesbians at risk of kind of harm from people that are kind of using them? You talked about unicorns a little bit. I don't know. I just wonder if you could talk about that dynamic, because I'm wondering how for queer women who sleep with men, how you don't just feel, as two women having sex, objectified by his gaze. Like, I've only had threesomes with other women, so I've got no idea. But when it's three women, I feel like that's gone, and that's the beauty of it. So, like, how the hell do you manage, like, having a man? Is my question.
No, that's a good question. So yeah, like if you're bi and you're getting off with women, like how do you avoid feeling objectified by the male gaze? I think like, you know, it's partly about like intention. You know, I understand like if you're not into it, then you're not into it. And like, but for some other people, like I think it can be hard to be objectified temporarily, consensually. And I think it also depends on like the guy you're with. Like, yeah, like I've definitely met guys who were like very weird about it, and I've met people who weren't. You know, like I think, yeah, like you know, as long as like. I personally think that like if a guy's able to kind of see your sexuality as like existing apart from himself, in the sense that you might be into things that he isn't, and that's okay. You know, like you might kind of sleep with other men, and that's okay, etc. Like that's usually a good sign. But yeah, I think mainly like in this scenario, it depends on the guy, and it also like depends on the intention behind it. And I think objectification in a sexual context, when done kind of consensually and like with kind of explicit communication prior, like can be fun and can be a good thing. But yeah, I mean, you know, if you're not into like a man watching you, like it makes sense, and don't do that. Like, yeah, hope that answers the question. Yeah, yeah. One more question. And not all male gaze is objectifying, for sure. So, like I said, it depends on the person. Yeah. Do we have? Okay, we're done on time. Thank you for all the questions. Hope you have a good rest